I still remember the sound of that folder sliding across the table. It was slow, deliberate, like my father-in-law wanted everyone in that room to watch. He looked me in the eyes and said, "Daniel, you have embarrassed this family for the last time. This marriage is finished." My wife, Clara, sat right beside me. She didn't say a word. She just stared down at her wine glass like I was already gone. If you enjoy emotional and dramatic stories like this, make sure to subscribe to Francisko's Stories. New stories are posted every week. I picked up that folder. I opened it slowly. Inside were divorce papers, clean, organized, already prepared. I could see Clara's signature at the bottom of the first page. She had already signed. Before the dinner. Before she even sat down next to me at that table. I looked at her. She still didn't look back. That was 6 weeks ago. And I want to tell you everything that led to that moment. Because the ending is not what any of them expected. My name is Daniel. I am 34 years old. I grew up in a small town. My father worked in construction. My mother was a nurse. We were not rich. We were not poor. We were ordinary. And for most of my life, I was proud of that. I worked hard. I saved money carefully. I built something slowly, brick by brick, the way my father taught me. I met Clara 8 years ago at a work conference. She was beautiful and sharp and funny. She laughed at my jokes. She asked me questions about my life and actually listened to the answers. I fell in love with her quickly. Too quickly, maybe. But that is how it felt. Like she was the missing piece of something I didn't even know was incomplete. What I did not understand at the time was that Clara came from a very different world. Her father, Richard, owned 3 car dealerships and a commercial property portfolio. Her mother, Patricia, had never worked a day in her adult life. They lived in a large house in the best neighborhood in the city. They took 2 vacations every year. They wore expensive watches and talked about expensive things. And when Clara brought me home for the first time, I could see it in Richard's eyes the moment he shook my hand. He looked at me the way you look at something that doesn't quite belong. He smiled. He was polite, but the message was clear. You are not what I had in mind for my daughter. Still, Clara and I got married 2 years later. It was a beautiful wedding. Her parents paid for most of it, which I later realized was their way of reminding everyone who was really in charge. I tried to contribute. I offered to cover the catering. Richard waved his hand and said, "Don't worry about it, Daniel. We've got it." He said it kindly. But what he meant was, we don't need your small contribution here. The early years of our marriage were good. Clara and I were happy together in our own space, in our own apartment. She worked in marketing. I was managing a small logistics company. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. We were building something together. The problem was that comfortable was never enough for Richard. Every family dinner became a performance. Richard would talk about his latest deal, his new car, his friend who just bought a boat. And then he would look at me and ask questions that were never really questions. He would say things like, "Daniel, are you still at that same company?" And when I said yes, he would nod slowly and say, "Interesting. No movement yet." Well, these things take time. He always said it with a small smile. That small smile became the thing I hated most in the world. Patricia was softer but equally cruel in her own way. She would say things to Clara when she thought I couldn't hear. Things like, "He's a sweet man, darling, but does he have a plan?" Or, "I just want you to be secure. That's all I'm saying." She planted seeds of doubt in Clara's mind, slowly and consistently, the way a gardener pulls weeds. Except she wasn't pulling weeds, she was planting them. And Clara, for a long time, pushed back. She defended me. She told her parents that I was hardworking and honest and that we were happy. And I believed her. I trusted her completely. But somewhere in the 5th year of our marriage, something changed. Clara started coming home from her parents' house, quieter, more distant. She stopped defending me in conversations. When Richard made his small comments, she would just look away. She started asking me questions that sounded like her father's voice. "Daniel, have you thought about a different career path?" Or, "My father says there's an opportunity at one of his dealerships. You could manage the operations." She said it carefully, but what she was really saying was, "My family doesn't respect what you do, and I'm starting to agree with them." I said no to the dealership job. That was apparently my first great failure. Richard never forgot it. From that point on, his small comments became sharper. He started telling stories at family dinners about men who had wasted their potential. He talked about his nephew who had taken a risk and started a business and now drove a luxury car. He was always talking about other men's success in a room where I was sitting. He never said my name. He never had to. I want to be honest with you. There were moments when I believed them. There were nights when I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and asking myself whether they were right, whether I was enough, whether Clara deserved more than what I could give. That doubt is a heavy thing to carry, and I carried it for years without telling anyone. I just kept going to work, kept coming home, kept showing up to those family dinners with a smile on my face. Because I loved my wife, and I believed that love was worth protecting. But I was also doing something else during those years, something quiet, something no one in Clara's family knew about. I was building, not loudly, not in a way that anyone would notice at a dinner table. I'd been investing carefully for years. A small technology company I had helped fund early on had grown significantly. I'd been buying small commercial properties in neighborhoods that no one was paying attention to yet. I had a partner, a man named Marcus, who was brilliant and patient and who shared my belief that slow and quiet was the right way to move. We had built something together that, by the time of that dinner, was worth considerably more than anything Richard had ever mentioned at one of his tables. But I never talked about it, not to Clara, not to anyone in her family. Marcus had always told me to be careful. He said, "Daniel, when people know what you have, they start calculating. Keep it quiet until the right moment." I listened to him. I listened too well, maybe, because the silence I kept gave Clara's family the room to fill it with their own story about who I was. And so that is the version of me they saw, the quiet, average, not quite enough husband. That is the man they thought was sitting across the table from Richard on that Saturday evening in November. The dinner started normally. Patricia had made roast chicken. Clara's brother Stephen was there with his wife. Richard was at the head of the table, as always, already telling a story about a property deal before anyone had even unfolded their napkins. I sat down. I poured myself water. I prepared myself the way I always did for whatever the evening would bring. Then Richard stopped talking. He looked at me, and the look was different this time. It wasn't the usual slow smile of quiet superiority. It was something more serious, more deliberate. He reached beside his chair and picked up a folder, a thick, cream-colored folder. He slid it across the table. "Daniel," he said, "I think it's time we were honest with each other." I looked at the folder. I looked at Clara. She had gone very still. She was looking at her wine glass. "Open it," Richard said. I opened it. The divorce papers were on top, then a financial assessment document, then a letter from a lawyer. Clara's lawyer, I realized. It had been prepared thoroughly. They had clearly been planning this for some time. Richard leaned back in his chair. "Clara deserves better," he said. "She has been patient. We have been patient. But you have not grown, Daniel. You have not provided the life our daughter deserves. And so we have made a decision as a family." Stephen nodded from across the table. His wife looked at her plate. Clara still did not look at me. "There's a settlement offer inside," Richard continued. "It's fair, more than fair considering the circumstances. We expect you to be reasonable about this." The table was completely silent. I think they expected me to argue, or to beg, or to push the folder back across the table and make a scene. I think they wanted me to raise my voice so they could remain calm and look dignified by comparison. That is how Richard operated. He always set the stage so he could play the hero. I took a slow breath. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out a pen. And I signed the divorce papers, page by page, carefully, without a word. I could feel the energy in the room shift. Richard's expression changed. He wasn't expecting that. He leaned forward slightly, like he wasn't sure he was seeing what he was seeing. Clara looked up at me for the first time that evening. Her eyes were wide. I closed the folder. I slid it back across the table. I looked at Richard. "Done," I said. The silence that followed was unlike anything I had experienced at one of those dinners. No one spoke. Patricia picked up her fork and then put it down again. Stephen cleared his throat. Richard opened his mouth. Well, good. I think... Then the doorbell rang. Richard frowned. Who is that? Clara stood up slowly. I'll get it. She came back 30 seconds later. Behind her was Marcus, my business partner, my closest friend. He was dressed simply. He was carrying a single manila envelope. He looked at me and I gave him a small nod. He walked to the table and set the envelope down in front of Richard. I'm sorry to interrupt your evening, Marcus said. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm Daniel's attorney and business partner. I'm here because Daniel asked me to deliver this in person. Richard looked at the envelope. He looked at Marcus. He looked at me. What is this? He said. Open it, I said. Richard picked up the envelope carefully. He opened it. He pulled out the papers inside, and I watched his face change as he started reading. Inside that envelope was a full financial disclosure, a legal document prepared by Marcus over the previous 3 weeks, from the moment Clara had told me she wanted a divorce. It showed everything, every investment, every property, every share. It also showed something else, a property valuation report for a commercial building in the city center, a building that had been purchased 18 months ago by a holding company that was jointly owned through a series of quiet transactions by Richard himself and a business partner of his, and leased at significantly below market rates to a company registered in Clara's name, a company that had been receiving those payments quietly for almost 2 years, a company that Clara had never mentioned to me. Not once. Richard's face went very still. Where did you get this? He said. His voice was quiet now. All the confidence had drained out of it. It's a matter of public record, Marcus said calmly. It just required someone to look carefully. I looked at Clara. She had gone pale. Her hands were flat on the table in front of her. Clara, I said, how long? She didn't answer. How long were you taking money from your father's company through that account? Still nothing. I wasn't angry. I want you to understand that. I had passed through the anger weeks before, in the privacy of my own apartment, when Marcus had first shown me what he had found. I had sat with it. I had processed it. And by the time I sat down at that dinner table, I had made my peace with it. What they had done was use our marriage as cover. The arrangement allowed Richard to move money in a way that reduced his tax liability, using a company technically owned by his daughter. A daughter who was married to an unremarkable, average, not quite enough man who no one would ever look at twice. It was elegant in a terrible way. And it had worked for almost 2 years. Until I signed those papers, because the moment I signed, the calculation changed. I was no longer a husband. I was a divorcing party with legal rights to financial disclosure. And any undisclosed assets connected to the marriage were now relevant to the settlement. The very thing they had used to dismiss me had become the thing that exposed them. Richard put the papers down on the table. Daniel, he said. His voice was different now. Let's talk about this calmly. I stood up. We are talking calmly, I said. That's what I've been doing for 8 years. I buttoned my jacket. I looked around the table. Patricia was staring at her hands. Stephen was looking at the wall. Clara was crying softly, silently, still not looking at me. I turned to Marcus. Thank you, I said. I walked toward the door. Daniel. It was Richard. His voice had something in it I had never heard before. It sounded like fear. We can come to an arrangement. The settlement can be revised. Let's be reasonable men. I stopped. I turned back one more time. You've been telling me for 8 years that I wasn't enough, I said. I want you to know something, Richard. I never needed your approval. I never needed your daughter's family money. I never needed anything from this table except to be treated like a person. And since that was apparently too much to ask, I think we're done here. I walked out of that house. The night air was cold and clean. Marcus walked beside me down the driveway. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then he said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it honestly. Lighter, I said. And that was the truth. The legal process that followed was not pleasant, but it was straightforward. Richard's arrangement was reviewed by the relevant authorities. The company in Clara's name had to be fully disclosed in the divorce proceedings. The settlement was revised significantly, more significantly than Richard had ever intended when he slid that folder across the table. Clara reached out to me once, 3 weeks later. A short message. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't known how far her father had taken things. Maybe that was true. Maybe she had convinced herself of it. I read the message. I didn't reply. I am not telling you this story to make myself a hero. I made mistakes in that marriage too. I was too quiet for too long. I kept too much hidden, and that silence allowed the people around me to define me. If I could go back, I would have spoken more clearly. I would have trusted my own worth without needing the world to confirm it first. But I am telling you this because of what I learned in that moment when I picked up the pen and signed those papers without hesitation. I learned that dignity is not something other people can give you or take away. It is something you carry, quietly, patiently, and when the moment comes, it speaks for itself. They expected me to collapse at that table. They had written a story in their minds where I was the weak one, the lesser one, the man who had always been just barely acceptable. And when the ending came, they discovered they had been reading the wrong story the entire time. I live in a different city now, a smaller apartment than you might expect, given everything. I like the quiet. I like waking up without the weight of someone else's judgment on my shoulders. I have coffee in the morning. I work on projects I care about. I call Marcus on Tuesdays. I am, for the first time in a long time, at peace. If you take nothing else from this story, take this. The people who underestimate you are not your problem. Your only job is to keep building, keep knowing your worth, and stay calm when they finally slide the folder across the table. Because the pen is always in your hand. The only question is whether you know it.